We give all the moms a hand in the room. All moms, your mom, if you are a mom, all moms, thank you. Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. Moms, we owe you guys so much. Not only did you bring us into the world, you kept us alive, because some of your mamas might have said, hey, I brought you into the world, I can take you out. And she could have many times, but you and your patience chose not to. So thank you, moms. Today is special for you. We celebrate y'all. Thank y'all so much for being our moms. So welcome to LifeSpring. If you're new, my name's Dylan. I'm one of the pastors on staff here. I especially want to welcome you. If maybe it's your first time ever in church, your first time back in church in a long time, we are thrilled that you're with us today. Before we get going, I want to let you guys know about something we have coming up on June 15th. We believe that God has called us not just to follow Him, but to become a committed part of a family that is committed to making a difference in our community and beyond. So ever since we launched LifeSpring almost 3 years ago, we've never used the term member to describe those who would maybe join the church, so to speak. We've always used the term partner, because partner carries this idea that I'm becoming a part of something that is not about me, but it's about working together to make a lasting difference in our community, to live for God, to love all people, to lead others to do the same. And so we believe that every single follower of Jesus is called to be a committed part of a local church. And so if you've been coming here for a couple months, 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, and have never taken the step of becoming a partner, our next partnership class is going to be on June 15th. It'll be at 5 p.m. You can sign up at the information desk. You can sign up online. There will be childcare and there will be dinner provided. It might be Chick-fil-A. I would show up just for the Chick-fil-A, to be honest, even if I didn't have to teach it. But so I would encourage you to sign up for that. If you have already been to partnership class but haven't yet filled out our partner covenant, man, I would really, really encourage you to do that. God calls us to belong and to be a committed part of the local church, so we can work together to make a difference in our community. And at the end of the day, we can do so much more together than we can on our own. So if you have a Bible and you want to follow along today, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26. If you don't have a Bible, no worries. Everything will be on screen. If you don't have a Bible because you don't own like a print Bible, you can pick one up for free at the information desk. And if you would like a Bible that maybe will take you a little deeper, that has like some study notes and stuff, we actually have a phenomenal deal on study Bibles at our information desk. Compared to what a study Bible typically costs, they're very inexpensive, and we eat a lot of the cost because we want you guys to have access to that. So I would encourage you to take advantage of that. Anybody ever had a moment in your life where you felt out of control? Show of hands. Cool. All of us, great. We're honest today. It's a great way to start. So with that in mind, how many of you have ever been on a roller coaster? Show of hands. Okay. How many of y'all are never going back on a roller coaster after going? Okay, great. Awesome. And so I've been on one roller coaster in my life, and if you've been here a while, and maybe I've used this story before, you'll just have to suffer through it. It's the only one I could think of for this morning. And so last September, my wife and I went to Carowinds for my birthday, because my favorite band, Skillet, was going to be there, and so we went to the concert. And included in the concert tickets was free admission to Carowinds, which I didn't care a thing about because I don't like roller coasters, but my wife does. And so she got these tickets for me about 3 months ahead of time, and she's like, "You're getting on a roller coaster." I'm like, I don't want to get on a roller coaster. But over 3 months, she kind of convinced me and talked me into it. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. So as we're going into the park, I'm like, well, let's do that one. It doesn't look very tall, and it doesn't have any like 90-degree vertical drops. And so I think it'll be fine. And so we get on, and the thing starts moving way before I'm ready. And as soon as we leave like the loading area, I'm like, this looks way higher than it did from the ground. And so my feet start doing this number right here, just from adrenaline. And then it starts to drop, and I'm like, I'm not going to scream. And the first drop was kind of like, and then it went from 3 miles an hour to about 65 miles an hour in about 3 seconds. And I screamed, like my voice hit octaves that I didn't even think were possible. Like maybe I could sing like soprano on the band if I was on a roller coaster all the time. I mean, I just screamed like crazy, and then I looked down at my feet and saw the sky instead. And so I was like, I just shut my eyes for the rest of the time. I'm like, this is not cool. This is not fun, and I feel out of control. So that's part one of my roller coaster story. But that's been our life story at some point or another, has it not? because we feel strapped in, we feel helpless, we're getting spun around, turned upside down, jerked around, and we're just like, Lord, please make this stop because I feel overwhelmed, I feel out of control, I feel like my life is chaos. God, can you please make it stop? And so we have those moments, but kind of like we've been saying all series, there are some times where we go to God, we ask Him for something, and He says no. And that can cause like this crisis point for our faith. It's like, well, if I ask God to remove something that I think is bad or give me something that I think is good and He says no, does He even love me? Is He still good? And we've talked about those two questions specifically the first couple weeks of this series. If you missed them, you can go back online and watch them. But we've discovered, yes, even when God says no, He's still good. He still loves us. And so the questions that come out of that are like, okay, well, maybe He's good and maybe He's loving, but is He actually in control? Is He actually able to deal with my problems? And so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at those two questions. And today the question we'll be looking at is this: when God says no, is He still in control? When God says no, is He still in control? Does He still have a plan? Is He still working things out for good? Is He still in control when He says no? So to answer this question, we're going to look at a situation in the life of Jesus in Matthew chapter 26, and here's how it begins. It says, "Then Jesus went with His disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and He said to them, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with Him, and He began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then He said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me.'" So let's pause and talk about the context for this. This is the night that Jesus is going to be betrayed by one of His closest friends, and is going to be handed over to the Jewish religious leaders, who are going to hand Him over to the secular authorities. And the next day, they're going to beat Him within an inch of His life. They're going to crucify Him, and He's going to die. So that's the backstory for what Jesus is going into. And you'll notice He uses this phrase that my soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. There's a few very, very important comments to be made in there. And the first would be this: it can be very easy and also very wrong to minimize Jesus' humanity. You might say, well, what are you talking about? Jesus is the most unique individual to ever walk the face of the earth. Here's why. Because at the same time, He was 100% God and 100% human. You might say, that's confusing. Well, it's because none of us will ever experience that. And so join the crowd. But He's fully God, and He's also fully human. And so as God, He certainly would have looked at what was coming and said, I can get through that. In fact, C.S. Lewis makes a point in his book, Mere Christianity, which I highly, highly, highly recommend you read, especially if you're a very linear, very logical thinker. You need to read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Great book. But he makes the point that it was important for Jesus to be fully God because only God could actually bear the weight of His own wrath against sin. Only God could deal with our sin. Only God could see what was coming and say, I'm still going to go through that. And by the way, that makes a tremendous point about the love of Jesus, that He knows everything that's coming, not just the physical torture, but also the spiritual agony of bearing the weight of God's wrath against sin from the very beginning point in history to the ending point in history and every point in between. He knows what His wrath against sin is like, and He knows not only is He going to bear it, He's going to become sin, and then for the first time in eternity, He's going to be separated from the Father. So He looks at that, He knows what's coming, and His divinity, He's like, well, I can do that. But in His humanity, His human side screams out and is like, this is going to be bad, which is why He says, I'm overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. In other words, you could say that Jesus was filled with dread, looking at this saying, this is going to be bad. Now, you might say, well, it seems irreverent to speak of Jesus being filled with dread, but again, 100% God, 100% human. In fact, the writer of Hebrews says this, and this is one of the most important passages in all Scripture. It won't be on the screen, but he talks about how Jesus was tempted in every single point that we were. but was without sin and is without sin. You might say, what's the point? The point is this: Jesus has walked in our shoes. Jesus has been in a place in life where he feels overwhelmed, where he feels the weight of the situation that is going on around him. He's been there. So when you have moments in life where you're like, this is chaos, this is overwhelming, I can't handle this, things feel like they're spinning out of control, Jesus would come along inside you and say, hey, you know what? I can sympathize with that feeling. I can absolutely sympathize with it. Because I've been in every single point you are. It is comforting to know that Jesus is not like, well, I can't relate to that. Jesus comes right alongside of us and he says, hey, I know what that's like. And so that kind of sets the table here. When you feel out of control and like life is chaos and overwhelmed, Jesus would say, hey, I felt overwhelmed too. I felt overwhelmed to the point of death. And yet, he still goes through the agony of betrayal, the agony of torture, and the agony of the cross. That's something profound about Jesus' love. Here's what makes it an even bigger deal. He did all that knowing that there were going to be a lot of people who would look at what he did and say, nope, I'm not interested. Jesus, I see what you did for me. Like, that's nice or whatever, but I'm just not interested in it. That's why that song we sang the last 2 weeks called Reckless Love, like that song is not making a statement about God being reckless because he's not, but from a human standpoint, to give your life for people who are going to be like, yeah, no thanks. That doesn't seem logical. It doesn't seem rational. It seems reckless from a human standpoint, but God is not reckless. But his love often seems from a human standpoint like it is. Because I know, I wouldn't even pay the fine of somebody who's going to be like, yeah, I'm not interested in anything to do with you. I'd be like, okay, you pay it yourself. The love of God, y'all, is unbelievably profound. The love of God is why he chose to go to the cross, and he did it for you. And he did it for me so that we would have a way back to God. Not because we were awesome, but he did it while we were still his enemies. And that's awesome. That's why we call it grace. We get something that we do not deserve and never possibly could have earned. So Jesus feels overwhelmed to the point of death, still is going to go through it, but then we have this really interesting thing take place in verse 39 where Jesus does this. It says, going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. A little pause here real quick. If you're here and you're maybe skeptical, you're maybe new to Christianity, you might say, if Jesus is God, doesn't he know everything? Well, in a sense, yes. And you might say, well, it sounds here like he doesn't know everything. Okay, this might be a little bit in the weeds, but it's helpful to know. Jesus is 100% God and fully united with the Father and the Holy Spirit, 3 in 1. If it's confusing, it's okay. It's a reality. But Jesus actually admits that he does not know every single thing the Father knows. You might say, where do you get that? Well, Jesus said concerning when he's coming back, hey, I don't know it, the angels don't know it, only the Father knows it. Which, by the way, just let me make this point. If you ever run into anybody and they're like, I know when Jesus is coming back, you can be like, they're lying. Or they're high or something, because Jesus is like, I don't even know, only the Father knows. And so you mean, Jack, whoever is going to come up with, no, probably not. So just don't fall for that. Just don't. And so Jesus, he knows this is the Father's plan to send him to earth to live a perfect sinless life and then to die. But in his humanity, he's like, this is going to be bad. And so he goes into his Father, probing the Father's mind to see, is there another possible way? But then he says this, and this is where the entire talk for today turns on. He says this, yet not as I will, but as you will. And the I and the you there in the Greek are emphatic, so it reads like, not as I will, but as you will. So here's the really beautiful thing here. Jesus in one moment is like, I'm overwhelmed to the point of death, and yet then he comes to his Father. He asks, is there another way? But then he ends his prayer with, hey, you know what? Whatever you want, Father, I'm submitted to that plan. This is not the picture of somebody in an emotional meltdown. Even though he feels overwhelmed, there's also, you get this sense of calm, this sense of peace, this sense of surrender and trust to the Father's plan. That, Father, even if this means I got to go through what would have felt like hell, I'm still surrendered to your plan. That's profound. And that starts to teach us something about the nature of prayer, which kind of starts to get teased out here as we keep reading verse 40. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour, he asked Peter. Watch and pray, watch this, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So ultimately, why does Jesus tell them to pray? It's not to get stuff from God. And you might say, well, doesn't God want to ask us for stuff? Doesn't God want us to ask him for things? Yes. In fact, James writes that the reason we don't have things is because we don't ask. But then he goes on and says, we often don't ask, or we don't often receive because we ask with the wrong motive. So yes, we're supposed to ask God for something, but we have to do it with the right motive. What is the right motive? Not as I will, but as the Father wills. And that's why Jesus says, watch and pray so you won't fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. In other words, you need to pray so that you stay in alignment with God's will, so you continue following me the way I've called you to follow me. Prayer is not primarily to get stuff from God, nor is it to change God's mind, and God doesn't change his mind anyway. It is to keep us in alignment with God's will so we continue following Jesus the way he calls us to. That is much different than the type of prayer we typically pray. Because the type of prayer we typically pray sounds something like this. Father, keep me safe on the drive home today. And keep idiots from texting and swerving into my lane. Make my spouse see how awesome I am so that we will do things that only married couples should do more often. Keep my kids from going nuts and make them calm on Mother's Day so I can take a 20-second nap. Give me a job or a better job. Give me a bonus. Give me a promotion. If you're single, get me a date. Even just one. They don't have to be awesome. Just a date. And please bless and sanctify this 1,500 calorie double cheeseburger with extra bacon and extra cheese and mayonnaise, and use it to nourish my bodies and not give me a heart attack. In Jesus' name, amen. Is that not what our prayers typically sound like? It sounds like this laundry list of God, make my life better, which, by the way, is the wrong motive for prayer. The point of prayer is not, hey, God, give me stuff, even though we should ask God for things. That's what James says. But the motive is not, God, make my life easier. God, make my life better. God, make my life more comfortable and give me the things I want. The motive for prayer should be not as I will, but as you will. We don't pray to change God's mind or get stuff from God. We pray to keep us in alignment with God's will so we can fulfill his plan for our lives. Which is why Jesus goes back and prays this in verse 42. He went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, unless I drink it, may your will be done. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed, the third time saying the same thing. So Jesus goes back in prayer. He is humbly submitted to the Father, even though he's in this place where he feels more overwhelmed than probably any of us have ever felt in our entire lives, because none of us have had to face like the weight of the sin of the world. And yet we're going to see, not only does he submit to the Father in prayer, he's also going to come out on the other side of it resolute, bold, and ready to go. In fact, we're going to see in just a minute, when Jesus comes out of his time of prayer, he's like, hey, you know what? Let's go and meet the betrayer that's coming. He doesn't go hide. He doesn't go run. He's like, let's go. It's time. He's not a man that's shaken. He's not a man that's freaked out. He's a man that is calm and collected And here's why, because Jesus knew this. When everything else is chaos, God is in complete control. When everything else is chaos, and from a human perspective, people would have looked at what was going on with Jesus in that moment and in the next 24 hours, and they would have been like, his life has just gone off the rails. Getting betrayed, getting tried illegally, getting handed over to the secular authorities, getting beaten, getting crucified, getting ultimately murdered wrongly and unjustly. This does not look like a guy whose life is in control. This looks like a guy whose life is out of control, and yet in that moment, Jesus was never more in control. The Father was never more in control. And what Jesus is painting us a picture here with his life is when everything else seems like it's chaos, when everything else seems like it's going off the rails, God is in complete control. And y'all, that can bring us such an amazing level of peace. In fact, let me speak specifically to the moms here for a second. There's a couple tidbits in here for you as a mom, so I want to share that. Moms, I know I don't have a child living on this earth. I shared a couple weeks ago how my wife and I went through a miscarriage and all that. But I know what it's like to, man, you want the very best for your child. Like the moment we found out Grace was pregnant, it was like, God, we want your best for this child. We want this child to know you and to pursue you and to experience your very best. And so I understand what that feeling is like. But moms, please hear me very clearly on this. There are going to be times where God's plan for your child does not involve their safety. And I know, and it's probably more of a thing with moms and dads, because dads are like, rub some dirt on it, you'll get over it, it'll be okay. But moms, you have this protective thing, and I get that. But man, understand this. God the Father knows what it's like to send his son through a plan that involved his son getting more beaten, more tortured, and treated more unjustly than anybody's ever been treated in the history of the world, and he did not stop it. So moms, don't feel like you have to step in and protect your child from everything. And that doesn't mean you need to be reckless. Like, don't let them go play with rattlesnakes. Like, that's just dumb and stupid. And you shouldn't do that. But there are going to be times where God has your child going through something and you're going to want to step in and stop it. And God's going to say, you need to keep your hands back. Because I know it's not safe for them. I know it's not comfortable for them. I know it's not pleasant for them. But I need to take them through this to make them into who I've called them to be so they'll accomplish my plan for their life. And yes, that might involve their pain. But mom, sometimes you just need to keep your hands off and trust that when everything else is chaos, even in your teenager's life, even in your young child's life, God is still in complete control. And you can rest in that. Jesus paints a picture for that in the way he prays and the way he submits to his Father. That's how we should act. How the disciples act is more along the lines of how we actually act. So, here's what happens with the disciples. Verse 45, he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? We shouldn't be too hard on the disciples here, and we're not going to be. Because isn't this what we do? Here's why the disciples were resting. Their best friend has been talking about, you know what? I'm going to die. And they're like, will you stop about the dying thing? Then he's like, oh, and one of you guys is going to betray me. Well, like that just makes you feel awesome, right? And then he's like, and tonight's the night I'm going to be betrayed, and tomorrow I'm going to be crucified. So Luke actually records that the disciples are like exhausted from sorrow. They're sad, and they're like, you know what? I know Jesus said we need to pray. It's like, I need to rest. Anybody ever been there? You're like, I know, like I should pray, I should do something, but I am wiped out and sleep will give me peace. Anybody been there? Yes, we all been there. So we can't be too harsh with these guys. But there's maybe a point to be made here. Man, don't let your feelings or even your physical needs trump what God says to do. Because physically, yeah, they were tired, but Jesus said, hey, you guys need to pray. So whatever Jesus says do it. And there will be times where Jesus says you need to rest. And in fact, for the men in the room, that's something we need to heed more often, because way too often we become workaholics who abandon our family and neglect our family. And then we wonder why our marriages suck, because we spend 80 hours at the office and like 2 at home. There are times where we need to listen to Jesus' voice to rest, but there are other times where Jesus is like, I know you're tired, but the best thing you can do right now is you need to get in my presence. You need to pray because it's going to get difficult. And the thing that will fuel you and carry you forward far more than physical rest will be spiritual refreshment. That only comes in my presence. But so often we do exactly what the disciples did, which is we go to sleep. And we can't be too harsh on them because that's exactly what we do. I think sometimes as Christians, we're way too hard on some of these disciples who we're like, they're so awful. And it's like, that's exactly what we do. We really shouldn't throw stones. And so Jesus says this. He says, look, the hour has come and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Here's what's so cool about that. The disciples flopped. In Jesus' greatest hour of need, they flopped. He's like, I need y'all to pray. They're like, we're taking a nap. And Jesus doesn't come and be like, man, y'all still sleep. Y'all stay there. I'm going forward. Y'all just do your thing. No, he says, come on, let's go forward together. So here's the point that needs to be made. And I don't know who this is for, but it's for somebody in this room. You may think, man, I keep falling down. I keep failing when Jesus calls me to do something. And I've failed so many times. He could never possibly ever want me to keep moving forward with him. But Jesus is going to do with you exactly what he does with the disciples here. He's like, hey, yeah, y'all failed. You know what? Let's keep moving forward because you know what? You're mine and I don't abandon my sheep. I don't abandon my sheep. By the same token, if you're here and you've never become a follower of Jesus because you're like, I have messed up way too often, hey, Jesus is still calling you to himself. And you need to know there's not a single thing you can ever do that will make God look at you and be like, yeah, I'm not interested in you anymore. He still calls you to himself. That, again, that's why it's called grace. And it's a beautiful thing when we start to rest in that. So the story one more thing, I failed to mention it, about the disciples. Another reason they would have been sad and frustrated is there was this little emotional issue they would have been dealing with that had to deal with their plans for Jesus. Because the disciples, like all Jews at the time, had a very political conception of the Messiah. That their conception of the Messiah was he's going to show up, he's going to kick out the occupying Roman government. He's going to make Israel great again. Like that was kind of their opinion. Political joke. It fell flat. That's okay. I'll move forward. Y'all need to laugh at political jokes, by the way, because we take it way too seriously. Way too seriously. And so Jesus is talking about dying, and they're like, this is not part of the plan. This, like, if Jesus dies, then what have we spent the last 3 years doing? So they're dealing with this turmoil. They're like, that's not really the Jesus. Like, we kind of had a script for you, and the whole dying thing, like that wasn't in the script. And so they're like, I don't know what's going to happen here. And so they're dealing with that too. Then verse 47 happens. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, do what you came for, friend. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. Now at this point, it gets really real for the disciples. They're like, oh, crap. Like these guys are arresting Jesus, and he's not stopping it. What in the world? That this is not what's supposed to happen. Ever had a moment in your life where kind of you have a plan, but then the opposite happens, and it gets really real, really quick? Anybody ever had that happen? Yeah, it's like, what do? We freak out. And what we try to do in that moment is we try to take control of the situation. So watch how the disciples try to take control of the situation. Verse 51. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. You might say, why his ear? Because he was going for the head and missed, and I suppose he just had very prominent ears. That's just my assumption. Like maybe they were like this, and he missed, and they just whacked it off. Now, there's something very noble to be said about the disciples here, that it's like, okay, they failed Jesus, but now they're like, Jesus, we knew we should have prayed. Man, we're going to fight for you now. And so what do? So they start trying to kill people. Because they're like, this situation is now uncontrollable. We need to take control. But see, here's what we fail to understand. When we try to take control of what is ultimately uncontrollable, we're actually the ones who become uncontrollable. But because the disciples, man, they're trying to kill people now. Here's a question. How are are you trying to take control of what feels uncontrollable in your life? Well, like how are you doing that? Because here's reality. Every single one of us has control issues. Like sometimes it's a little more obvious, like if you're wired like me, you're very much a type A, kind of out front, want to be in charge sort of person, it becomes easy. Maybe it's because maybe it comes out through being very domineering, being very, hey, you listen to what I say right now. Nobody does does something like you kind of like that. Maybe it's being very aggressive, very assertive, and you just kind of like a bull in the china shop. You're like, listen to me. And people are like, control freak. And some of us try to comfort us. We're like, I'm not like that. But see, the people on kind of the more backstage or behind the scenes sort of personality, you have control issues too. You know why? Because maybe you're not like a bull in the china shop, but you're OCD. You got to have the perfect plan and the perfect calendar. If you're a mom, you got to have like the perfect life for your child. You got to make sure that they don't touch a single germ, ever. Which, by the way, it's not good for their immune system. You should let them eat at buffets. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's just my opinion, my experience. From eating at buffets my entire life, hey, I'm still happy and healthy. There you go. But maybe you try to take control because maybe you're manipulative. Or maybe you're passive aggressive. Like you won't come right out and say, I think your idea is garbage. But you're going to be like, I really don't. That plan, I don't think. That doesn't make sense. I can't even be passive-aggressive because it's not my personality. I'm more like, if I think your plan is trash, I'm going to be like, I think that's trash. I don't think that's very smart. But see, we all try to take control of the situation in certain ways. But man, reality is this. Control is an illusion. It really, really is. No matter how hard you try to control something, control is an illusion. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have like a good plan and good boundaries and that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, you can't be in control because you're not in control. And when we try to control the uncontrollable, the only person that gets out of control? Me. I get out of control. And the more out of control I get, the more I will do things that I never thought myself capable of. Like cutting off people's ears. So what's Jesus' response here? Verse 52, put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? Here's Jesus' point. He's like, hey, put the sword up. Like, I know you think you need to take control. I know you think you need to take charge here. But do you see me freaking out? I'm not freaking out. If I wanted to put a stop to this, don't you think I could? But then he says, but then how would the scriptures be fulfilled? In other words, yeah, I could stop this, but God has a plan. I'm trusting in that plan. So write this down. You guys in the back can throw this on the screen. It's this idea here. Since God is in control, I don't need to take charge. Since God is in control, I don't need to take charge. We think we do. We think we have to figure it out. We think we have to make the perfect plan. But we don't. Since God is in control, I don't need to take charge. Because here's the thing that we need to understand. If God wanted to put a stop to the uncontrollable situation in your life, you know what? He could. He could stop it right now. He's fully capable. You might be, well, why doesn't he? Because he has a bigger plan. How will the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen that way? He's got a bigger plan. And so when you're like, God, will you make this stop? And he's like, no, you need to trust. He's in control. You don't have to fix it. You just need to trust him. Moms, you don't have to have the perfect plan for your child. And I know that maybe hits really close to home for some of you because maybe you're like, well, man, my child, they're going off the rails, or they've gone off the rails. At the end of the day, moms, you can set up your child to follow Jesus by raising them well, and that's awesome. But at the end of the day, you simply need to trust Jesus, because at some point, your child's going to make their own decisions. And you need to trust God. And trust that he's got a plan. And trust that if he doesn't pull them out from something, that he's got a plan in it. And in some cases, moms and dads, maybe the reason God is taking your child through the unimaginable is because maybe, just maybe, that's the way your child is going to meet him. And maybe the worst thing you can do is pull them out. Since God is in control, I don't need to take charge. Jesus goes on to say this, verse 55. In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this is all taking place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then watch this. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. This is also what we do, and this is another form of trying to take control. When our efforts to take control don't work, you know what we tend to do? We tend to check out. We're like, well, I can't control this. I can't fix this, so I'm gone. I'm done. And you know how we do this specifically? What you would maybe call escapism. For instance, life at home is terrible. Maybe your marriage is a wreck, but you're like, but I can kill it on the job. So you throw yourself into work. You're just escaping. Maybe you're like, you know what? I can't control the way people treat me at school, but I can control how I look, and so you develop an eating disorder. Maybe you're like, my life feels uncontrollable, but when I take in a substance, whether it's a prescription medication or alcohol or maybe even watching porn, then you feel like, well, then I feel better. I feel more in control. I feel like life is a little more put together. Here's the question, because sometimes we think of escapism as just running to some of those big ticket items, but man, here's the question. What is it you're running to that you think is going to fix everything and that keeps you from having to deal with the mess that you're in right now? What is it that keeps you from having to face the fact that your life is out of control? You know what a big one for a lot of us is? A little thing we keep in our pocket that we scroll mindlessly on. You sit down, your eyes start doing this right here. Really? You do it at home because life isn't great around you, but as long as I'm engaged with fake relationships on the internet, then I don't have to deal with the stuff around me. It's escapism. And you know what the funny thing about it is? It does nothing to fix the problem. For example, if you're in school and you have a subject that you despise, let's just say grammar. If you're a grammar teacher, this is not directed to you. I just didn't like it in school, still don't like it, so whatever. It's just an illustration. Just bear with me. So if I'm like, I despise grammar, I hate it, I don't like it, I know I got a test coming up, I'm just not going to study because I don't like it. I just can't bear looking at grammar and diagramming sentences, and if somebody tells me ain't a word again, I'm going to blow up. So I'm not going to study. Does that keep me from taking the test? Yes or no? No. In fact, because I'm escaping, guess what? Now the test is going to be a lot worse. And I'm going to be more stuck than I would have been before. Escapism is the same way. We buy the lie that running to this other stuff keeps us from having to deal with this, when reality is this other stuff, this uncontrollable situation, it's still there. And you're not making any progress, you're still going to have to navigate it. And until you navigate it, you will never move forward in your relationship with Jesus. That's why some of you, and I say this very, very gently, very graciously, because I was there for a long time. So some of us in here were spiritual babies. Because you've made a commitment to follow Jesus, maybe you've taken some next steps, but there's an issue in your life that you just simply refuse to face, and you keep running to a whole bunch of other stuff, and God's like, until you deal with this, you're never going to move forward. And we don't deal with it by running from it. We deal with it by facing it through the lens of God's word, covered in prayer, and with each other. With each other. I know, like, guys, we talk about this a lot. But man, don't underestimate the value of community in the local church. Like, there's this very unbiblical idea that's like, well, I can follow Jesus on my own with my Bible and I don't need other people. Wrong. You don't get that from Scripture. Jesus didn't even try to do that on his own. There's a reason Jesus picked 12 guys to do life with. And even in Jesus' hour of greatest need, he wasn't like, I'm going to go do this thing on my own. He's like, hey, can you guys come pray with me, pray for me? If Jesus asked other people to be there for him, how much more do you think we need other people to be there for us? Don't do it alone. You can't do it alone. Can't do it alone. And together is, by the way, the only way we'll deal with this whole escapism problem. Because as long as we escape, as long as we run from it, you'll never deal with it. But if you'll follow what Jesus modeled, and you'll lean into it and trust God and trust that since God is in control, I don't need to try to take charge of the situation, guess what? You have peace. Because at the end of the day, God has a plan. And when Jesus comes back from the dead in Luke chapter 24, he has this conversation with the disciples. He said to them, this is why I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, this is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations. In other words, guys, I know it felt like chaos, but the Father had a plan. In other words, it'll be on screen. I messed up the guys in the back because I pulled this way out of order, but they'll forgive me. But the idea is, again, since God is in control, I don't need to take charge. I don't need to take charge. I don't have to figure it out and get it perfect. God is in control. And you know what that breeds in us? It brings a sense of peace. It brings a sense of hope. It brings a sense of joy. It brings a calm confidence that knows that, you know what? Life may be busting apart at the seams, but God is in complete control, which brings me to this. God's control brings calm into my chaos. God's control brings calm into my chaos. The fact that he has promised to work out everything for his glory and my good brings calm into my chaos. That doesn't mean that I won't ever have moments where I feel overwhelmed. And it doesn't mean I won't have moments where I weep and I'm sad and I'm brokenhearted. Like, calm is not, I got rose-colored glasses on and everything is bright and sunny in Mayberry. That is not what it means. Calm is, you know what? Life is tough right now. But I can be calm. I can have joy. I can have anticipation because ultimately God is in control. And if he's not stopping this, then he has a greater plan that he's working, and I simply need to trust him. It's kind of like this. Going back to my roller coaster story, that was a terrifying experience in so many ways. But and so, like, when I get to the end of that, like, my hands are gripped on the harness so tight that I've got to, like, convince them to come off. I'm like, you guys can let go now. We're stopped. Okay? And my legs were, like, straight out like this because I was just, like, freaked out. And I'm, like, getting off and I'm all shaky and that sort of thing. But guess what? I would ride a roller coaster again. You might say, why? Because I was never in danger. And sure, I might have been, spun around, twisted around, all that sort of stuff. But man, I was never in danger. And so next time I go, I'm sure I'm going to be freaked out again, but I can have this sense of anticipation and excitement that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so here's what I kind of learned from that. Life is a roller coaster, but in many ways, God is the harness. And yeah, you're going to get spun around. Yeah, you're going to get turned around. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's even going to be terrifying at times, but God's got you. And that doesn't mean you won't scream at times. But at the end of the day, we can look at it with anticipation, knowing, you know what? God's got me here, and He's got me. And He's got something greater in store, and if I'll trust Him and trust His control, that's what brings me calm. And where that starts, where we're trusting God's control starts, is when you stop trying to be in control of life. And not just from a planning standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint. Because for many of us, where we're stuck today is, I want to be in charge. I want to run my own life. I want to be my own God. But see, that doesn't lead us to peace. That doesn't lead us to hope. That doesn't lead us to joy. That just leads us to more stress. In fact, if you're here today and you've always bucked at the idea of giving your life to Christ, then, man, I would say, man, you're trying to be in control, but seriously, how's that working out for you? Is it producing calm? Is it producing joy? Or does it seem like you're just spinning faster and faster and faster? What you need to do is, instead of trying to run your own thing, surrender your life to Christ. Repent of your sin, turn to Him, follow Him, and you'll find that He will bring calm and peace in your chaos.